Well, good morning. My name's Todd, and I'll be preaching this morning. And as Steve mentioned earlier, we're working our way through the book of Exodus. And as we get ready to look at this next passage, we're looking at chapter 3 in Exodus. As we get ready for that, I'm going to introduce you guys to somebody. So this is Walter. Walter is, if you can't tell from where you're sitting, Walter is a stormtrooper. Finn and I bought Walter at a comic book store in Richmond a few weeks ago, and Walter is like an original on the back of his leg. He has like the 1977 stamp, so he's like an original, like old vintage Star Wars toy. They had in this comic book shop, they had a bunch of like just old Star Wars figures for sale, and so we bought this guy, this little like beat up stormtrooper. He is missing a thumb. He's like, right, it's 40 some years old. He's been through a lot. He's got some bits of super glue on him where I think a blaster had been glued in after the thumb broke off. But he's just this old stormtrooper. And after we got him, Finn asked me if he should have a name. And I think part of the reason he asked me that is because he knows that there's a character in Star Wars named Finn. And Finn in Star Wars started out as a bad guy, and then he became a good guy. And part of what happened when he became a good guy was that he got a name. And so Finn thought, well, if our stormtrooper has a name, then maybe he will also start to become a good guy. And I thought that was a really great idea. So we decided on Walter as his name. And so the reason I'm introducing you to Walter is because names are really important. Right? Names are rooted in relationship. So in Star Wars, Finn gets his name because he becomes friends with this other character named Poe Dameron. And, Finn doesn't have a name up to the point. And he's like, you need a name. And so he starts calling him Finn. And names mean that we are known. Right? So as a stormtrooper, this is really just, a fancy suit of space armor. And every one of them looks the same. And as a stormtrooper, this is just one piece out of this vast anonymous army of stormtroopers. But this guy with the glue on his hand and the missing thumb, this is Walter. And Walter went on holiday with us to Denmark. And Walter, he tried hot dogs and quesadillas when we were in Copenhagen. And Walter has a story. And learning about his story begins with learning his name. And so the text that we're looking at this morning, in this text, God reveals his name to Moses. And this is a key moment in the story of the Exodus, because God isn't distant and unknowable. He's not far off. He's come near. God isn't just some God or one out of many gods. He is, as we said this morning, he is the steadfast God of love and justice. He is the maker of heaven and earth. He is the God who saves. He is the God who calls his people into a relationship with him. And so God has a story. God is writing a story across all time. And learning that story begins with learning his name. And so if you will, please follow along. In your Bibles, we're on page 46 in the Pew Bibles. And we're going to read all of chapter 3 this morning, all of Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come up to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, unless compelled by a mighty hand. And so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty. But each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry and clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. Please pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this word. We thank you for this, your word. We pray that in the time we have together this morning, that you would give us ears to hear and hearts to believe the good news of your gospel promises to us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So, in picking up from last week in chapter 2, the second part of chapter 2, Moses has fled from Egypt. He's run from Egypt. He's living in Midian. He was 40 years old when he left. He had spent his whole life living as a prince in Egypt. But then Moses became concerned for his own people, for the Hebrews who were living as slaves in Egypt. And so in a moment of haste, Moses kills an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. And then when Pharaoh learned about it, he sought to have Moses killed. And so Moses had to run away. And so he ended up in Midian. And he found a wife, and he started a family. And now it's 40 years later. For 40 years, Moses has been living as a shepherd in Midian. Right, so in these first few chapters of Exodus, we have kind of these big time jumps that happen as we're brought into the story. So there's 40 years that pass between chapters 1 and chapters 2 of Exodus, and then another 40 years that pass between chapters 2 and 3. And so when God calls to Moses from out of the burning bush, he's 80 years old. He's lived in exile for as long as he lived in Egypt. And so we need to think about what that means for Moses. We can imagine that Moses, after 40 years in Midian as a shepherd, right, his memories of Egypt are going to be distant and faint. He's not going to remember a lot of his early life in Egypt. I mean, that's just what happens to all of us. Time goes by, and the things that we remember from long ago, they get sort of more faded and thin. And so whatever burdens or concerns that Moses once had for his people, I don't think they've gone away, but they've quieted. I mean, Moses had failed in his efforts to help. Right? He tried to help and he failed. And he barely escaped with his life. And for him, I mean, it's reasonable that he would think, well, maybe that's the end of that story. And so whatever is going on in Moses' mind, whatever his state of mind, one thing we can be sure of is that as he's out tending his flock, he's not expecting the burning bush. Right? I mean, he was not expecting that any more than any of us would. Right? If you're just walking along and you see a bush that's on fire, you're not expecting that. And we call it the burning bush, but part of what grabs his attention is that it's actually not. Right? The text, I mean, the heading in our Bible even calls it the burning bush, but the whole thing that actually grabs Moses' attention is that it's actually not burning. I mean, this bush is just enveloped in fire, and yet it's not consumed. It's not actually being burned up. And so it's hard to imagine what that even looks like. And so I'm sure if we saw it, we would be just as amazed, just as dumbfounded by it as Moses is. And then what immediately becomes clear to Moses is that nothing about this situation is ordinary. Right? This thing is on fire, and yet it's not being burned. And then a voice calls out to him from the bush and says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then we're told that Moses immediately hides his face because he's afraid to look at the holiness of God. Now, in the evening service tonight, we're going to spend a little bit more time looking at kind of the symbolism of fire in Exodus and in the Bible as a whole. So I'm only going to say a little bit about it here. And if you're curious, you can come and we'll talk more about it tonight in the evening service. But the short of it is this, that throughout the Bible, fire represents the presence of God. Right? Fire is consuming, it is powerful, and yet it's also attractive and it draws us to it. I mean, think about a bonfire. Right? I mean, you're outside and it's cold and there's a bonfire and you want to stand near it for both the warmth and the spectacle of it, but you also can't get too close because it's dangerous and uncomfortable. And this is a symbol of God's presence, that it is both beautiful and powerful. And in this moment, God himself appears to Moses, and then he tells him what he's going to do. He tells him that he's going to rescue his people from their slavery and from their suffering in Egypt. And then he says, not only am I going to do this, God tells Moses that he's going to do it through Moses. And so you might imagine that this is a lot for Moses to take in. Right? I mean, it's been 40 years. Moses has a home and a life in Midian. We might not think much about the life of a shepherd, but for Moses, he had a good and comfortable life. Plus, as I've already mentioned, the last time he tried to help his people, I mean, it was a complete and utter failure. I mean, it went bad. In chapter 2, verse 14, Moses tried to intervene between two quarreling Hebrews, and they asked of him, who made you a prince and a judge over us? And so Moses, quite naturally, is thinking, well, what if they ask something like this again, right? I mean, they rejected me before. If they reject me again, what am I supposed to say? How can Moses convince God's people that it is really God who has sent him? And so he asks God, what is your name? And God answers by saying, I am who I am. Which sounds like a really confusing and not very helpful answer. And then he goes on to say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moses is looking for assurance. Moses is looking for God to say, you're going to be fine, you're going to be great. But God does something different. Right? God tells him his name. We can be sure of our salvation Because God has given us his name. The name of God gives us assurance because it's rooted in relationship, in respect, and in reliability. And so the first thing we're going to look at this morning is that the name of God is rooted in relationship. And we've already talked about that a bit, that names are about knowing one another, knowing and being known. And so God begins answering this question about his name. He begins answering actually before Moses even asks it. If you look back in verse 11, Moses says, "Who am I? Right? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" Which is a weird thing to ask, right? Because he grew up as a prince of Egypt. But he says, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out?" And so this question reveals something about Moses' own fears, right? His own worries and concerns about inadequacy. Like, yes, he has this legacy, but he kind of squandered that when he killed an Egyptian. So, he remembers his past failures. How am I going to do this? And so first I want us to think about all the things that God doesn't say. Right? God doesn't say to him, "Don't worry, Moses, like you'll be fine. You got this." He doesn't say to him, "Look, you're a grown man. You're capable. You know how to take care of yourself. You grew up in Egypt. You were educated there. You know all the wisdom of the Egyptians. You're an experienced shepherd. You've been doing this for 40 years. You know how to lead and to care and protect. You know how to do these things." That's not what God says. God doesn't build Moses up and tell him he can do it. What does he say? In verse 12, God says, "I will be with you." When Moses looks for assurance, God offers him a relationship. "I am" communicates the presence and the closeness of God. In verse 6, God says, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So in other words, God is saying, "I have been with you. I have been with you and your people." And when he says, "I am who I am," God is saying, "I'm the one who's speaking to you right now out of this burning bush. I came to you. I called to you, and I'm with you right here and right now." And when he says, "I will be with you," God is promising his presence and his relationship for everything that is yet to come. God isn't distant or God isn't distant or far off. He isn't abstract or unknowable. He draws near and he makes himself known to us. I mean, we read it in chapter 2 last week. He sees us and he hears us and he knows us. God gives us his name as a sign of his relationship with us. So I have a question I'm going to ask you guys, not a rhetorical preacher question, but an actually you can answer it question. Who can tell me the name of the bad guy in the Harry Potter books? Lana. Voldemort. All right, but here's the thing. Is that what most people call him? No. What do people call him? Rue. He who must not be named. That's actually what we call the Alexa speaker in our house. We'll refer to it as "she who must not be named," because if you say her name, she wakes up and starts doing stuff you don't want her to do. Right, but Voldemort is known as he who must not be named, or sometimes they just say, "you know who." Because in those books, Voldemort is so greatly feared that people are afraid to even say his name. And so instead, they use these other terms, "you know who," "he who must not be named." And of course, by continuing this custom, it only makes Voldemort more frightening, more scary, more unknowable. I mean, he establishes his power by cutting himself off from other people. His power is the opposite of relationship. Voldemort fears relationships because he doesn't want to share his power with anybody. And so he realizes that one of the best ways to push people away is to actually deny his own name. But God doesn't do that. God doesn't push us away. He draws near to us. He calls us into a relationship with him. And he does it by telling us his name. Now, the name of God is also rooted in respect, the holiness and the otherness of God. He says, I am who I am. Right? So that means God defines himself by himself. He's self-existent. He is self-sufficient. He doesn't exist by any other means. He doesn't derive his power from any other source. God simply is. He's eternal. He's the maker of everyone and everything. God's name reveals that he is a God for every season of life, for every circumstance, for every eventuality. He's a God for every task and every burden. He's a God for every need or for every want. Most people in the world today, most people throughout the history of the world, we would rather define God for ourselves. We would rather decide who God is or who we want him to be. We want a God who is love without judgment. I mean, we see that kind of this time every year in the celebration of Pride. I'm not going to go off on a big thing about pride because really every human construct does the same thing. So whether it's a political ideology or a social ideology, any of those kinds of things, we want God to be what we want him to be. We want God to be defined on our own terms. So we want him to be love without judgment, or compassion without holiness, or forgiveness without justice, or perhaps we want justice without mercy. But the name of God teaches us that God isn't some abstract concept. He can't be changed to suit our preferences. He can't be changed to match the changing winds of culture. God isn't a social construct. He isn't a philosophical ideal. God is. Right? That is a full, complete sentence. God is. And there really isn't a lot more that has to be said about that. He is who he is. God is the ultimate reality. He's the beginning and the end. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. God calls us to respect who he is by telling us his name, by saying, I am. Now, in our Bibles, whenever you see the Lord written in all caps, and I know we've said this before, but I think it's always helpful as a reminder when we see the Lord kind of printed in all caps in the text, that's referring to the name of God that's revealed right here in Exodus 3. The Hebrew letters, which are Yod, He, Vav, He, which is just YHWH in sort of English letters, that's the name for God. Now, Hebrew is a language that only has consonants. It doesn't have any vowels. I actually wrote in my notes it has no consonants, which is wrong. It has no vowels. And so we don't actually know anymore how the name of God was meant to be pronounced. We know that it uses sort of the same consonant, a very similar construct as the verb to be, and so we'll talk about that in a second. But we don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. So we'll often say we'll say Yahweh. We kind of just take a guess at it, and so we'll say Yahweh, and I'm sure you've heard that before. We don't know if that's correct, because over the course of their own history, the Hebrew people, they became so worried about using the Lord's name in vain that they stopped using it altogether. Their desire to respect the name of the Lord actually led them to do the opposite. One of my favorite seminary professors is a man named Jerram Bars. Jerram's originally from England. He taught apologetics and evangelism at Covenant Seminary. And I remember there was this class in particular where a student raised his hand to ask a question, and he started his question by addressing him as Dr. Bars. And so Jerram very quickly, but very politely, corrected him and told him, that he doesn't have a doctorate. So it's inappropriate to call him doctor. He's like, you don't need to call me doctor. I'm not one. Furthermore, he said, you can just call me Jerram. And so then the student kind of went back to his question, and this time he addressed him as Professor Bars. And so Jerem kind of patiently said, really, please, just call me Jerem. And so the student replies, well, I'm sorry, Professor Bars, I'm only trying to be respectful. And so finally Jerem says to him, well, actually, I think it's respectful to call me by my name. Because he had invited us to do that, right? Respect involves actually listening to what someone says to you. God's name deserves our respect. And actually what we're meant to do is show respect for God's name by using it. And so that's why we in the church now, we so often follow kind of the model that was set for us, because we don't know exactly how to pronounce Yahweh. And so we regularly address God as Father, because that's what Jesus did. And that was scandalous in its time. Right? I mean, for Jesus to claim God as Father, that was scandalous, and that was offensive to the religious leaders of his day. But when God draws near to us, we actually show respect to God when we call him Abba, Father, because we have been invited to do that. And then finally, the name of God is rooted in reliability. Excuse me. That he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That he is the God who has shown up for his people again and again and again. He is the God who makes and keeps great, big, huge promises. He is the God who promises to be with his people. And so that name of God, those 4 Hebrew letters, they look very similar to the Hebrew verb to be, right? There's a bit of a play of words that goes on there when God says, I am. And so that means embedded right into God's very name is the promise of his presence, of his reliability, that he is just as he always has been and just as he always will be. God's name is a testimony to his reliability. God tells Moses that he has heard the cries of his people, that he's going to rescue them, that he's going to send Moses to be his rescuer. He tells him that Pharaoh's going to refuse, but that God himself will stretch out his hand and he will strike Egypt with signs and wonders. He tells Moses that as they leave, the Hebrews are not only going to be set free, he says they're not going to leave empty-handed, that they are going to plunder the Egyptians of their gold and their silver. And he says when all that is done, then the people of God will return to the same mountain, at the same mountain that Moses is on. So in our text, it's called Mount Horeb. Later, it's called Mount Sinai. Same place. And they're going to worship him. And it's an amazing promise. And God's name is the assurance that he will do it. God's name is reliable. I thought about this several times this week, and I kept trying to think, like, what's a name that communicates reliability? And the thing I thought of is really silly. But there is this company in the U.S. I haven't seen it here, but there's this company called Smucker's that makes like jam and like what Americans call jelly, but like preserves fruit you'd spread on bread, on toast. I would put it on with some peanut butter, which I know some people here think is gross, but it's delicious. But there's this company called Smucker's, and they used to have these ads where they said, with a name like Smucker's, it's got to be good. And I've never understood what that meant. Because part of me thinks, well, like maybe like Smucker's is sort of the like the sound you make when something's good. But it's also a really silly name. So maybe it means, well, if our name is this ridiculous, then the thing we make better be good. Like, I'm not really sure. But the point of that is that, right, their name is assuring you of something. It's communicating the reliability. And so the name of God assures us of his reliability. God says, I'm going to rescue my people. I am going to rescue my people. And so even though God is self-defining because he is the source and the maker of all things, he's about to give his people a definition for his name. And that definition is the Exodus. It is the deliverance of his people the salvation of his people. I am is the name of the God who saves. After the Exodus, if you ask any Hebrew who their God is, they will tell you the story of the Exodus, that we were slaves in Egypt and God delivered us. They'll tell you about the God who saves, the God whose name is reliable. And so when Jesus comes, right, when he comes to save his people, we read this passage this morning, when he comes to save his people, in John 5:8, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. And just like how God says it in Exodus 3, it's a weird thing when Jesus says it, unless you understand what God said in Exodus 3, that this is his name. And it's the assurance of who he is and what he will do. It's the reliability that he is the God who saves. And the religious leaders understand that when Jesus says it. And so the next verse tells us that they picked up stones and they were ready to kill him on the spot. Jesus was claiming to be God, the one who is, the one who calls us into a relationship with him, the one who commands our respect, the one who is reliable to keep his promises. And so just as the Exodus proved that God is reliable to save, the cross and the resurrection of Jesus prove that Jesus is reliable to save. In Exodus 3, God tells us his name, that he is the God who saves. In John 8, Jesus claims that name of God as his very own. And then in Romans 10, Paul kind of brings all of this together for us when he says that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. In Jesus, God came down to his people, just like he said he would. He suffered and he died to set his people free. And he rose from the grave to secure our new life with him forever. And then before he ascended to heaven, the last thing Jesus said was, I am with you always. I am. I am with you always. The name of God tells us who he is and what he does. And it tells us who we are and how we relate to him. By his name, God calls us into a relationship with him. He teaches us to respect his holiness. He assures us of his love and that he is reliable to do what he says he will do. God has told us who he is. And so the question for us this morning is that do we believe him? When God says, I am the God who saves. I am the God who has come to you and is calling you into a relationship with me. Do you believe him? Do you trust him? And are you prepared to follow him? Right? That's what's going to happen in the story of the Exodus. God's going to come to save his people, and they're going to have to believe him and follow him through the desert. Because everyone who God calls to himself must believe and call upon his name to be saved and follow him into eternity. We can be sure of our salvation because God has given us his name. Please pray with me.